Well, hi, everybody.
Hi.
That's Colleen, or Colleen, if your name is Parr, Turner, or, Bates, or Zibbits, or pretty much
The family.
the family. The rest of the world is Colleen. Sorry, Therese.
And this is the babbling professor.
Today we're going to talk about Alfred. Alfred the Great. All the way up to Elizabeth II, if you have time for this.
Although technically we're beginning before Alfred.
Are we, though? We're just talking a little bit about invasions and stuff. But I should be telling you right now, this is brought to you by the letter B. B as in babbling. What?
Or bullshit.
Bullshit professor. So, as Colleen said, we're talking about stuff before Alfred. Just like how England is just like an island that just loves to be invaded. Right, Colleen?
True that.
All right. So first there's the Romans. Hi, Roman invasion.
Hi, Romans.
You're not picking up on. You gotta talk faster, more excitement.
Sorry.
Aren't you an elementary school teacher?
You're good cop, I'm bad cop. Go on.
Okay. All right. Then there's the Germanic invasions. How many different German tribes are there, Colleen? Three. What are they?
The Angles, Jutes, and Saxons.
No, you go Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Oh my!
You do?
Yeah, that's how you. Everybody knows that's
I'm
how you
not
do
the
it.
babbling professor. You're doing great.
Okay, thank you. You're not doing too bad. I think you have more personality you can
I'm
let
here
out,
for
though.
dry sarcasm. Move
Okay,
on.
all right. So yeah, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Oh my
Oh
god.
my.
Let's try this again. Anglo-Saxons and Jutes.
Oh my.
If this takes more than 3 hours, you know why. I'm coaching her on how to do these things. So, when the Germanic tribes invade because of the pressure of the barbarians, or whatever you want to call them, coming in from the Caucasus, and the Huns, and the Mongols, and the Golden Horde, and all that, the Romano-Britons, that's the people that mixed between the native Celts and the Roman invaders. A lot of them actually went back to the Roman Empire. So there's not just an invasion, there's an outvasion.
Or mixed vasion.
Mixed vasion, right. Then there's the fun Norse invasions. Don't call them...
Vikings.
We don't like to call them Vikings. You can call them the Northmen, the Norsemen, the Norse. Just don't call them...
Or Danes.
Yeah, because in particular, the Danes are the ones that really whacked the east coast of England. Good point.
And it's a good TV show.
Do you want to plug your TV show right now? Because they don't know what you're talking
Oh,
about.
I love Uhtred.
Uhtred from
The Lost Kingdom.
The Last Kingdom is
yeah.
the name of the book in the series and the TV show. And you can find that on
Netflix.
You're so good, hon. All right. Later, we're going to talk about the Norman invasion. I just felt the need to put all of the invasions in. So you got the Roman invasion, the Germanic invasion, the Norse invasion, and later, 1066, the last great invasion, the Norman conquest.
Which is where most history things start.
Right. Yeah, and you just, Colleen doesn't want this in here. She thinks it's unnecessary, but trust me, it's necessary. You got to keep all the invasions together. So back to those not Vikings. What do we call them?
Norse or Danes.
The Norse or the Danes. In fact, the Danish section of England was called, this is a dumb name, the Danelaw. But hey, whatever. And into this mix was, with the original people, were the House of Wessex. This was one of the Heptarchies that was one of the original kingdoms of England. And why do you think, Colleen, the House of Wessex, I can say it, is the one that unified the rest of England and defeated the Danes?
It was the last to get conquered, wasn't it?
And I don't even know if it was ever completely conquered, but it was the House of Wessex is in Wessex, which is in the west side of England, therefore furthest away from those invading Danes.
Did you say Heptarchy?
No, Heptarchy is what we're eating tonight. Hepatitis in plagued turkey. We're gonna have the whole flavor.
I was thinking it was like hemp turkey, like
Colorado
hippie turkey
style. No, I was thinking it was hepatitis A through Z.
Oh,
Huh?
why is it a heptarchy?
Because hept is a number, right?
Okay,
What number is hept?
I don't know. 9. Six?
6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. So you got the Kingdom of Northumbria, the Kingdom of Mercia, the Kingdom of Wessex, the Kingdom of Sussex, Kent, Essex, and East Anglia. The other thing that's interesting about these, since you asked, is these are the original duchies as well. So once the Kingdom of Wessex took over and created England, these ancient names became the first, and still are today, among the most important of the duchies.
Is this the beginning of the really crappy naming? Because we've got Wessex, Sussex, Essex. It's like we can't name anybody but Edward and Henry from here on out.
Pretty much. But if you, on the east coast of the United States, there's counties and towns all named after these places. So, like the county that Boston is in is the county of Middlesex. I lived in Warwick, which was in Kent County. There's an Essex, Connecticut. So these are the names of the English parts of the United States. Let's keep it going. So Alfred, he was the youngest of 5 and somehow wound up being the second most important. And he was given the name Alfred Secundus because he was the backup to his older brother. But with his older brother, they defeated the great heathen army of 865, and then his brother died, and his brother, this is what's weird, Colleen, I know we were talking about this the other day, that his brother skipped over his own sons as heirs and named Alfred as his heir. Why do you think he would name his brother to be his heir, not his kids?
Because his sons were wieners.
Or because they were young, he didn't think that they could handle the Danish invasions.
And they became wieners.
And they became wieners. Okay. And Alfred the Great, he was no wiener. He was Alfred the Great. He was the Great Wiener. And yep, he defeated the great heathen army, as I mentioned before, of Guthrum the Old, later resulting in the Treaty of Wedmore, in which the Danes agreed to leave, and Guthrum agreed to be Christianized and baptized, and then they broke the deal and they came back. Darn Danes, they came back. So then, Edward the Elder, who was the son of Alfred the Great, he defeated his cousins, those kids that Colleen was just talking about.
That were wieners.
The wiener cousins, yes. And then his sister had become the Queen of Mercia, and with his sister's help, he imposed his rule. So now you have Wessex imposing its rule on Mercia, 2 of those Heptarchies, and we know what number Heptarchy is now.
7.
7, definitely not 6. Whoever said 6 was an idiot. And then he takes the title King of the Anglo-Saxons. So now we have this growing terminology. It's not just the King of Wessex, it's the King of the Anglo-Saxons.
Anybody who's not a Dane.
Or a wiener.
Or a wiener.
Right. And then...
No, I think he was saying he was king even
King of the Wieners?
Yeah.
He's King Wiener?
Well, he defeated the wieners.
Yeah, he did.
So he is king.
Let's see how many times we can not say wiener ever again in the rest of this.
Okay.
All right. So moving on. Edward the Elder defeats the Southern Danelaw and expanding that rule. Then we have a whole host of these Saxon kings that nobody actually cares about except for their moms and probably not even their moms. And we go through Alpha Stan, then there's Edmund.
Mund.
And then there's...
Adred.
You're so good. And then there's Vig, who probably Vig, right? They're Germans, probably a V.
True.
Then there's
Edgar.
And then there's Edward, the martyr. And then we have this question about Ethelred. Do you think Ethelred's ready?
Apparently.
You think? All right. No, he's not ready, Colleen. He's a bad king. You're not ready. Because we have
Sven. Sven's fork beard.
And his cool fork beard. Yeah. Okay, that becomes the second royal family of England, although I don't think the English want to admit that that's their royal family, but Sven did become king of England, or king of the Anglo-Saxons, whatever. So you'll notice, though, he's a one and done. You got Sven, and then Ethelred wants to check out. He has another question, Colleen. What's his question?
Is he ready now? Am I ready now?
I think he might be. Yay! He's been restored. The House of Wessex is restored. And then his son, Edmund Ironsides, he thinks he's ready too. Well, it's not looking good for Edmund Ironsides, because guess what?
We go back to the Danes.
Yeah, the Danes get restored. There's the restoration of the... anybody want to try that name? Let's just call it the House of Denmark.
Kninklingra.
Yeah, it sets you up for the next king that I know you love to say his name. Go for it. Go for it. What are these?
Heptarchies.
Right. Well, you skipped to the end there. The first one was your favorite to say, wasn't it?
Knut the Great.
It's a dangerous word, isn't it?
It is. Or
Yeah,
you replace two
Yeah.
letters and you have a bad word.
No. Yeah. But he's great. He's not Wiener the Great though. He's something different than Wiener the Great. He's the Knut
the Great.
Awkward. Let's move on. Then Harold, he either has a hairy foot or a lucky rabbit's paw. I don't know. What do you think?
A rabbit's paw?
Paw? Maybe.
Hairfoot. I think it's a rabbit foot.
Okay. And then we have the great Harith Canute. Congrats, Harith Canute.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, they always say behind every great man is an even greater woman.
That's right.
In this case, it's his mom. She rocks. Emma, she was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. She married Ethelred the Unready and had her oldest two sons, Edward and Alfred. Then her husband died, Ethelred the Unready. This is so confusing. Then she gets remarried. She has a third son, Harthacnut. And then her third son, the youngest son, is the one that becomes the king first because he was the son of the king of...
And he's the only one with an original name.
Right.
Besides Edward and Alfred.
But they do have the funny little A-E thing. That's kind of
true.
cool. All right. She's a
badass.
She's a badass. And then we restore the House of Wessex again, and then we bring in her other son, Edward the Confessor.
It's like the prequel to the War of Roses.
I was thinking Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody having sex with everybody and backstabbing everybody.
Yeah, but there's only 2 families.
In what?
In this. Whereas
that's true.
Game of Thrones is like, what, 5?
Well, remember we have Godwin's son.
Oh, that's true.
So we've got some other stuff. So, do you know the problem with Edward the Confessor?
He spends so much time confessing, he doesn't have any kids.
No. You're right. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. No kids. He did claim the throne over when he restored he restored his house with the help of this guy Godwin, who later becomes the father of Harold Godwin's son. Hence, you know, that whole third family that I was talking
and
about.
how can you go wrong when you got God on your side and you're winning?
Reminds me of PC basketball in the late 90s. You know, they had God, Sham God on the... You know, there we go, talking about sports again. Anyway, back to this House of God's Wine.
Ooh, this is even better.
Right? So, yeah, the Earl of Wessex, Goodwin, he helped Edward the Confessor restore the House of Wessex. And then Edward the Confessor married one of the women in the House of Goodwin, which made, see if you can follow this, which made this other guy, Harold, Edward's brother-in-law. That's important. Did you follow that?
Yeah.
So what I want you to know is that
we
the
still can't
Goodwins,
have girls.
yeah, the Goodwins helped the House of Wessex reclaim the throne, and then the two families intermarried. That's what I want you to get.
Yeah,
Okay.
and still the girl gets screwed.
That's how they make babies. The girl gets screwed.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
And she doesn't get to be queen.
Emma was a badass.
She was, but she still wasn't a queen. Anyway, go on.
So Edward the Confessor, he lived and reigned for a long time. He brought stability to the island in ways that hadn't happened in the last 100 years or so. The problem is, again, he dies with no heirs. So allegedly he promised it to 2 people, but the guy who claims the throne right away is Harold Godwinson, his brother-in-law. All right, that's how long he reigned. But
wait, go back. Go back.
What?
As I said before, I never repeat myself.
Mm-hmm. Ha! Well, if people listened to me and remembered what I said, I wouldn't have to repeat myself. Anyways, so you got Edward the Confessor with no direct heirs, but he's got a brother-in-law who claims the throne first, and then he's got this guy waiting out in the wings, a distant cousin of his, William of Normandy. Spoiler alert, he's called William the Conqueror. Guess who wins?
Emma's side of the family, because she's a badass.
Well, you were just saying that it's good to have God on your side, the good ones, and yet they wind up losing.
Well.
God is dead, Nietzsche. So anyways, Harold, son of Godwin, he's in this precarious situation because there's a third claimant to the throne, and this is the brilliance of William. is that even though Harold is in England, William winds up in the better strategic position because Harold, Harold, is invaded from the north by another guy whose name is Harold with 2 A's. And so while Harold and Harold are fighting, that's not confusing at all.
No.
William waits for the 2 Harolds to bleed each other off, and more importantly, for Harold Godwinson to travel north up to York to fight the other Harold, which allows the Normans to cross the English Channel and establish a beachhead without being attacked.
It's almost like the Avengers in the Civil War, where Stark and Captain America fight and kill themselves, so the one guy doesn't have to worry about the Avengers anymore.
I see what you did there. Yeah,
see?
yeah, that's exactly that.
Yeah,
good. Go team. So the Normans then they get to pick the battlefield. They pick the the battlefield of Hastings, known as the Battle of Hastings, 1066, in which the Normans, with superior cavalry, with superior armor, and later with superior castle building skills, they defeat the Anglo-Saxons, and he rushes to London, claims the throne, claims the capital city, and then closes the city walls and just waits out the Anglo-Saxons. And and on the right, there's you don't travel without your bishop. You know, Bishop Odo, his brother Robert, and William.
That says Rotbert.
Well, it's the German pronunciation and spelling of Robert.
Rotbert.
Well, he's not William either. He's Wilhelm.
True that.
Okay, so maybe I should have flipped those slides. That's why we're doing this practice round, not just for Rennie and Jason and Therese and
Murphy making lots of noise on the bed.
Great idea, keeping him in here with us.
He was asleep.
And that's not happening anymore. Anyway, so this is a better visual of the 2 Harolds fighting, and then William sneaks in the back. So there's the spot where Harold Godwinson died. Oh no, sad spot. He died. And then the Normans are in charge. Now, this is what I wanted you to appreciate, Colleen, is that look at the red. Look at the Normans conquer all of England, but they still have the Duchy of Normandy back in France. They have territory in 2 countries. And this sets up the problems later with the 100 Years' War, because William has 2 crowns. He's got his ducal crown, where he is the Duke of Normandy, which is in France. Right. So as the Duke of Normandy, he owes his allegiance to the King of France.
True that.
But at the same time, he's the King of England.
He's trying to make his own name. It's like the American way.
You're amazing with your metaphors and allusions and allegories, and yeah.
Is that sarcasm?
Not from me. So we got this House of Normandy. The House of Normandy. Oh, right. The House of Aaron and Colleen.
Yay.
So
but not in that order.
No. Why did Aaron ruin this?
Because her shirt would be backwards.
Yeah, if I flip the picture, you can't see that it says Colorado. She's the oldest, so she should go first, right?
I guess she'd be queen first.
All right. So the House of Normandy winds up with like these 3 or 4 different names. Their first name is the House of Normandy, and basically William, Henry, Stephen, and Matilda, they used the name House of Normandy. The later members of the family, starting with Henry II, used the name House of Anjou, which is a territory in France that they own.
And don't be confused with
Anjou.
The dipping sauce.
Although, if they were wieners, they would be a pork product that you could
roast
that's roast beef, not roast pork. You don't think you could still put the roast pork into the wiener sauce? I mean the au jus sauce?
I'm sure we probably could.
All right. Okay. I wanted to tell you about Matilda. I left her out before, but I wanted to throw in another badass woman and also show how she got screwed. So Henry the First of England, right? He had only Matilda. Well, he had another son, but he died as a child. So he has a Matilda.
Henry the First has Matilda? Mm-hmm. No, I thought he marries Matilda. Oh, he has another Matilda. I got you now. Okay. I got it.
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. So he invests all of his energy in making sure that the Normans will accept Matilda as his heir, because generally they don't accept female rulers.
Rude.
And she was awesome. She was betrothed to the Holy Roman Emperor, who made her his representative in Rome. She ruled Rome for her fiance for a while. And then Henry spends all this time getting all of the Normans to agree that they will accept Matilda as their ruler. Henry dies, and Matilda's cousin, Stephen, screws the whole thing up, claims the throne. Now, Matilda is a badass.
There's a reason there aren't many Stephens.
She is a badass. She invades England with her forces and her fiance's forces. She defeats half and conquers half of England, including the capital of London. She goes to London. She claims the crown and the throne. And the Normans say, well, I mean...
We can't accept girls.
And so she never gets the title Queen of England, but she's allowed the title Lady of England.
Just like poor Mary later.
So Matilda is amazing, and she got hosed. But anyway, so that House of Anjou, not...
Jusas? No, what's that called?
Later became known as the House Plantagenet. I don't know what is wrong with these people and why they're choosing these stupid names. Actually, do you know what the word Plantagenet means? The etymology?
No.
They think it has something to do with a broom.
Broom?
Hey, I am from the House of Broom. We are going to sweep you out.
I'm from the House of Vacuum.
Yes, Kent Bates taught you well. So the House of Anjou, also known using an adjective form, is the Angevin dynasty. That's basically it's Henry II's family. So Henry II marries another badass woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who owned the Duchy of Aquitaine in her own right. She is actually...
a big manipulator.
She's an amazing manipulator, like most women. And she actually, Henry's her second husband. She was first married to the King of France. They had 2 daughters. They never had any male heirs. The King of France blamed her for it and was like, okay, I want a divorce. I'm done with you.
Isn't he Catholic?
Yeah, and gets an annulment too. He's rich. He gets to pay for them. But then she's like, okay, fine, I'm done, but I'm taking my duchy back. She takes her duchy back, marries her ex-husband's rival, Henry II, and immediately pops out 4 boys. And a bunch of girls.
What they didn't know was that the dad determines it.
Weird. So Henry has a couple of boys that die young, William and Henry the Young King. It winds up being Richard that becomes his heir, but there's this an issue of historical revisionism. We don't really know the whole story. A lot of people think that Richard might have been gay. He was either gay or he just really didn't like being a king. He spent his entire time with the army fighting. You know, he was in the Third Crusade and everything. And similar to his ancestor, Edward the Confessor, he was spending all this time fighting. He had no time for
making heirs.
Heirs and spares. And so even though he's famous, you know, Richard the Lionheart, a lot of the responsibilities fell on his baby brother, John Lackland. Do you remember why John Lackland's called John Lackland?
Because he lacked land.
Because all of his older brothers, particularly Richard and the other brother that I didn't mention yet, Geoffrey, they wound up with titles. John, there were no titles left to go around, but he was the youngest and he was his mommy's boy, and so Eleanor trained John into the craft of politics. And John, in my opinion, was a very successful politician in ways that his brother and his father weren't.
And why wasn't Geoffrey king?
He died before Richard died.
Yeah, that's right.
And his titles were mostly in France anyways. It would have been interesting what would have happened. But I digress. So my historical critique is that we always talk about how Richard is great and we undervalue John.
When actually Richard was only in England for what, 30 days?
30-something days. Spent most of his time either in France fighting the French or on the Crusades.
John.
Yeah, John spent a lot of time in England running England. Those are the parents again. This is a visual. You can see how big Aquitaine was. It was almost the same size of England. And like I said before, they had tons of kids. King of France. And so the House of Anjou is Richard the Lionheart, no kids. John Lackland ultimately becomes King John. And he has his progeny become the royal families. And these are people that you guys... Therese, Erin, Colleen, you guys are all related to John Lackland.
It was unfortunately named after the toilet. I mean, the toilet was named after him.
It wasn't named after Thomas Crapper?
No, I thought it was the John.
So we got Richard Lionheart, you got John Lackland, actual photo of what he looked like while he was pouting when his brother was putting all the pressure on him. He is criticized for losing the Duchy of Normandy, but in some ways that
it's not his fault because his brother was off fighting.
Well, he lost it when he was king. He lost it because, in many ways, because his brother, if you want to blame it on the brother, because his brother spent so much money, there was no money left to raise an army.
Wars are expensive.
Now, wars are expensive. They take money and lives. And when John did try to get more taxation revenue, the barons revolted. And so he's criticized for losing prestige and power to this barons' revolt, but he signed the Magna Carta, which became the basis of modern democracy in the West. So,
and my favorite, what does Magna Carta mean?
Big paper. He signed a big paper.
He didn't know
everything
got rid of his power.
Everything
sounds
sounds
better.
It was just
a big paper.
Yeah, everything sounds better in Latin.
It does.
So yeah, he fought down a couple of revolts during his reign. Signed the Magna Carta. He died. Most people do. And yeah. Questions about John?
He's our ancestor.
Yeah. And so he has a pretty successful son in Henry III. I would give Henry III a C. But then he has Longshanks. Longshanks is amazing. Longshanks conquers Scotland. He's the first English king to conquer Scotland. Do you remember what he does when he's in Scotland? How do you become king of Scotland?
Oh, he stole the stone thingy-mabobber.
To become a king of Scotland, you have to be sworn in and inaugurated on the royal stone, which is called the Stone of Scone. Tastes great, by the way. He steals their stone and brings it back to England. He's like, can't be a Scottish king if I have your stone.
I sat on it. It's mine.
Mm-hmm. And he even built a box underneath the throne. And you can see that when you visit, I think it's now in Westminster. You can see the box that was built to hold the Stone of Scone.
The stone is now back in Scotland.
Some Scottish nationalists stole it in late 60s, early 70s or so. It was missing for a while, and then they felt the heat from the cops, and they turned it back over. They left a note, you can find it here, or something like that. And then the Scottish were like, can we have it back?
And Queen Elizabeth II, who's very kind, gave it back.
She allowed them to have it. So Longshanks is amazing. Longshanks is not a wiener, or if he is a wiener, I guess he's a
winner,
a long winner, or a Longshank.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I have this theory it's my Tom Keefe's theory of alternating leadership. And so you very often, if you have a good leader, you're followed by a bad leader, and vice versa. Anything
like Obama and Trump.
Yeah. So anyways, Longshanks was so dominant, so powerful, so pushy. He was badass. His son was a loser because his son never had room to grow. Poor son. But then his son was actually overthrown by his son. So let me say it. Edward Longshanks is a badass. He has a weenie son, Edward II, who was such a weenie. You're not supposed to. I said weenie, not wiener. But he was. I mean, how big of a wiener do you have to be if your son overthrows you? Dad, you're doing this wrong.
Happens again later too.
Yeah. But Edward III is awesome. Edward III is most famous for having 3 sons and being one of the primary belligerents in the 100 Years' War. His oldest son is known as the Black Prince. His second oldest son is the Duke of York. And his
that's Peppermint Patty.
The Duchess of York, Peppermint Patty. And then his third son is John of Gaunt. And John of Gaunt is known as John of Gaunt because he was born in Belgium. Nowadays we call that town Ghent, not Gaunt, but that's where the name comes from. He was given the title Duke of
Gaunt?
Lancaster.
Oh, okay.
And he went through 2 wives while he still was sleeping with his favorite mistress, Catherine, on the side. Finally, after his second wife died, he decided might as well just marry the mistress.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's our family.
There you go.
There you go.
Catherine is the 21st grandmother of Colleen and Erin, I guess. which makes her the 20th grandmother of Therese and Patty, and so forth and so forth. But that also means that all of these other people are family too, right?
Yep.
There you go. You're a badass, or related to badasses at least. I don't know. Sadly, we got to Richard II. Richard II is the last Plantagenet. He is the end of the primary line. So you have the two. Do you know the term cadet? So he's the last Plantagenet. He's the son of the Black Prince, primogenitor. Okay. The other two brothers that I mentioned, the Duke of York and the Duke of Lancaster, those are what are called cadet branches because they do not follow primogenitor.
Primogenitor?
Prime creator.
Oh.
Primogenitor.
Oh. Okay.
And so he's the last Plantagenet. That's the only thing he's even famous for, is just being the last. Which brings up the cadet branches. Somehow Lancaster, which is younger, junior to York, becomes the inheritors of the throne.
AKA Aaron and Colleen's family.
Right. Yeah. So this is another one of these kings that you're related to. Henry IV is the first king from the House of Lancaster. He's the son of John Gaunt, and John Gaunt is again one of your ancestors. So then you go through Henry, and Henry. It's kind of like that old Hermit's song. Do you know that Hermit song? And everyone was an Henry. Henry,
no, Willie or Sam. No, Sam.
But in this case, it wasn't Henry VIII. It was Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI. Henry VI was, remember that alternating theory thing I was telling you about?
Oh yeah, stinky and awesome and stinky and awesome.
So Henry V was a manipulating bastard.
Huh. Was he really made out of wedlock, or just acted like a jerk?
No, he was a successful political and military leader.
Okay.
But he was one of those people. He's so dominant. His son
is stinky.
In a compassionate way, though. His son is really sensitive. Doesn't like armed conflict. Doesn't like arguing. Doesn't like wars. And so, as a result, pretty stinky king. Right? And so he has literally mental breakdowns over the 100 Years' War and the stress of being king. So finally, one of his cousins, Richard of York, who had been helping him, was like, dude,
you suck.
I'm going to replace you with my son. At least then we can get things going. So that's what the War of the Roses is, the conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Do you want to tell them about the Roses? Why it's called the War of the Roses? Do you know this? Remember this one?
I don't remember.
So the War of the Roses, it's called the War of the Roses because both families on their coats of arms have roses.
Oh, that's right.
Because that goes back to what's called the Plantagenet rose. But in heraldry, you differentiate even as you copy. So while they both use the Plantagenet rose, they changed, the two families chose different colors. And for us, for our sake, they did this for us. You ready for this? This is nice.
Ah.
It's alphabetical. The House of York, which is at the end of the alphabet, has the white rose.
Ah.
Y, W. And then the two that are at the beginning, closer to the middle, I guess, of the alphabet, the Lancasters, have the red rose. So you'll see the red rose because of the Tudors, the Henry VIII and Elizabeth and Mary, because they're the descendants of the Lancasters, they too will always be photographed with a red rose.
Is there a reason why that one's flipped in the other? Like, no?
Nope, just
okay.
I put it that way to make them fit artistically.
Check. So
what's amazing is the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, and fun fact about the 100 Years' War?
Not 100 years.
Not 100 years, 116 years. But there was only 7 years of peace before the War of the Roses broke out. These guys just like to fight. And so the House Plantagenet, the cadet branch of the House Plantagenet, the House of York, they claimed the throne in the person of Edward IV, and Edward IV is really just the stooge for his dad, Richard of York.
But he married.
He screwed the whole thing up by marrying Anne Woodville.
No, Elizabeth Woodville.
Elizabeth Woodville, sorry. And why did the court not like her? Do you remember?
Because, well, she was connected to the Lancaster side, and she was a commoner.
Yeah, she was. Her family was they were powerful, but they didn't have as close of a claim to noble titles, and so they just despised her. He proposed to her secretly. Then he was told not to marry her and married her anyway.
It's a good book too, by the way.
What book's that?
About the White Queen. She's supposedly does witchcraft from her mother and blah blah blah. Anyway.
Or what? A smart, successful, manipulative woman? Must be a witch. Dun dun dun.
Of course.
But yeah, she's pretty cool in her own right. So because he had alienated the leaders of England, they were very susceptible to Henry VI's return. So Henry VI had a second reign, and
but
this
he doesn't like to fight.
He doesn't like to fight, and Edward IV loves to fight. Edward IV does this trick where he goes, okay, I'm okay just being the Duke of York. Let me go back to York, and I'll just live the rest of my life as the Duke of York. Boom, gets to York, raises an army, marches south, defeats the House of Lancaster at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, then enters London unopposed, where Henry VI was taken prisoner, and then, conveniently, did you know Henry VI got sick and died?
I did hear that,
Yeah.
Yes. Conveniently.
How convenient. I don't believe that for a second. But yeah, Henry VI died just days after he was taken prisoner. Most people think he was murdered. That Battle of Tewkesbury is where the House of Lancaster was slaughtered. All of the members of the House of Lancaster are dead.
Except...
Well, there was this other kid. There was a kid that was from a cadet branch of a cadet branch, if you can follow that. But let's talk about him in a second. Let me just say that Edward the Fourth, when he reclaims the throne, but then gets sick and increasingly gives power to his brother. Everyone is named Richard, right? He gives power to his brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, and makes Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, promise to be the protector of the young heirs, the twin princes, who are just 12 years old when their father dies. And so Edward V of England becomes king, but is never crowned because his uncle, Richard, blocked it. And this goes back to that cadet branch that you're talking about, because
and Richard becomes a real dick.
Well, yeah, that's my whole point. Is these the twins disappear. These are the missing twins in the Tower of London, right? So most people believe that Richard, Duke of Gloucester,
I'm not sure they're twins.
The twin princes.
I don't think they're like born at the same time.
The missing brothers are twins, yeah.
Not my understanding.
Tewkesbury and Edward.
Okay. I think they are.
We can look it up. So anyways, because of the fact that Richard took power from his brother, then took power from his nephew, and that the nephews went missing, all this builds up this disregard for and disrespect for him. And he was also a hunchback. So physically, people didn't like the look of him, and they certainly didn't like his reign.
Including Shakespeare.
Right, because Shakespeare was hired to do the play, Richard III, by the descendants of the people who beat Richard. So he has a vested interest in making Richard look bad. There was also the rumor that he was going to marry the twins' sister. He was going to marry his niece. Like, in these royal families, they're always marrying, like, their cousins.
It's better than brother and sister, like Game of Thrones.
Well, the Egyptians, they did that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was this rumor he was going to marry his niece. Why would he marry his niece?
Because she was cute.
And she was a redhead. She was the only other person other than Richard who had a strong claim on the throne. So if he married her, he would strengthen his own claim, but also remove any potential rivals.
Well, especially since he already killed the other boys.
Right, maybe. So,
supposedly,
because he's behaving this way and nobody likes him and everything, these women started plotting. And these older women of the court started plotting about this niece, this young Elizabeth of York. She was in her own right a badass. She was the daughter of a king, a sister of a king, a wife of a king, a mother of a king. She had the claim to the throne herself. But she winds up being a pawn between these two elder women of the court. You want to take over this one?
Elizabeth Woodville, who's a badass, and then Margaret Beaufort, where I'm related to.
Yes, she's also a cadet branch of the Lancasters. But these two elder women of the court, they decide that Margaret Beaufort's son should press a claim to the throne.
And he's been hidden all this time.
So he had been born. He's her only child. They lived together in Wales till he was about I think it was 9 or 10, and then she sent him to France where he'd be safe from the Yorks
with her uncle or his uncle.
And then she got married 3 more times. She was married 4 times. The last one being Lord Stanley. That plays into the later story. But she and Elizabeth Woodville conspired to make a betrothal agreement between Henry Tudor, who was a cadet, and Elizabeth of York, who has a strong York claim to the throne.
So they're ending the War of Roses by uniting the houses to a regular Plantagenet family.
Right, without having to marry your niece. Because that's what Richard was going to do too.
Just a little bit more, yeah.
Yeah. So Henry the Tudor promises at the Cathedral of Rennes, he swears in 1483 that he will marry Elizabeth of York.
Even though he doesn't like her.
And then they planned the invasion. So, remember that Lord Stanley I mentioned? Lord Stanley was Margaret Beaufort's 4th husband. He is the stepfather of Henry Tudor. And he is the 3rd largest... he has the 3rd largest army in England. Maybe the 4th. There's Warwick as well. So you got Warwick, Stanley, Richard of York, and Henry Tudor. You have these 4 large standing armies. Well, when Richard finds out that Henry has landed in Wales, he orders the soldiers to go out and seize Henry Tudor. Guess what they don't do?
I don't know.
They don't seize Henry Tudor. So now Richard III thinks that Stanley might be playing both sides of the field. Get it? The field, the fields of Bosworth. And so he wants to make sure that Lord Stanley will be on his side. So he arrests Lord Stanley's son. And he says, Lord Stanley, meet me at the battle at the fields of Bosworth, and so we can destroy the young Lancastrian Tudor army. And Lord Stanley sends him a sick note. Sorry, not feeling well. Catch you next time. And Richard sends him back a note. Dude, I have your son under lock and key. And allegedly, Lord Stanley responds, I have other sons. Doesn't that make you feel good as a child? But Lord Stanley shows up at the battlefield anyways.
Because he has an ulterior motive.
So 3 armies
arrive. He's married to Tudor's mother.
Yep. And so they line up on the battlefields, the fields of Bosworth. You have the York army, the Lancastrian Tudor army, and in the middle you have Lord Stanley's army. The battle commences, and Stanley switches sides. The 2 armies, Stanley and Tudor, surround the York army, and Richard III falls from his horse during the battle.
Yeah, and then falls into a parking lot.
Well, before he falls into the parking lot, he yells out, allegedly according to Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. He gets no horse, he gets no kingdom, and he dies. But what Helene was referencing is that his body went missing after the battlefield. There's these records that they put it in a church and buried him and then left him there. By the way, fun fact, do you know who crowned Henry Tudor, Henry VII? Lord Stanley picks up the crown off of the battlefield and crowns his stepson, the son of Margaret Beaufort.
Nice.
And he becomes Henry VII.
That's loyalty.
But anyways, back to the horse, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Yeah, Richard gets buried. They lose track of what church they buried him in. History just forgets. And there was this repavement going on in Leinster. How do you say that? Lanchester.
I don't know. Manchester.
And yeah, that word. And so they were repaving. They dug up to get a good lay of the foundation for the pavement.
7-Eleven?
It was 7-Eleven parking lot next to the church, and they the remnants of a church, and they find a body. And I mentioned this earlier that he was a hunchback. Most people thought when Shakespeare referred to him as a hunchback, he was using a literary device to show his wickedness. And sure enough, they dig up the body, and guess what?
He's a hunchback.
He's a hunchback. So think about how old Queen Elizabeth II is. She's ruled since the 1950s, right? So we're talking 60 plus years. There hasn't been a royal funeral since her dad died, King George VI, until 2012. Richard III had a royal funeral 500 years after he died in the fields of Bosworth.
Out of the 7-Eleven parking lot.
Check out how tiny his casket is.
Well, he was hunched.
Yeah, it saves room.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the House of Tudor. And the House of Tudor...
Not Tudor like you're tooting.
Or tutoring.
Right.
Right. So this is a cadet branch of Lancaster. Henry Tudor takes the throne, takes the title Henry VII. He is not exactly warm and fuzzy. You mentioned this earlier. What does he think of his wife?
He doesn't like her.
No.
He did it to unite the houses, but...
And
his mom was making him do it.
His mom made him do it. In fact, he was also suspicious of his fiancée because, as I said, she is a member of the House of York. She could claim the throne in and of herself. And so he didn't want anybody to think that he was only the king because he married her. He insisted on the right of conquest as the justification for his throne. Which is why
he crowned himself before he got married.
To show that he was the king regardless of her, and then later he married her, just on the side.
Even though she could have been queen, but we still get have girls.
Mm-hmm. We're getting closer though, because it's their daughter that winds up becoming. No, their granddaughter becomes the first reigning female. So the Tudor family everybody talks about it, but it's actually quite a small family. It's only in charge for about 3 generations. You have Henry VII, who has 4 surviving children, Margaret, Mary, Arthur, and Henry. And then, as we know, Arthur dies after he's engaged to Catherine of Aragon, so then we have Henry VIII, and then Henry VIII has 3 kids, and that's it for the House of Tudor. Do you want to take a break, or want to keep going?
We can keep going, but let's talk about Margaret because we want to address Mary Queen of Scots for a second.
Okay, go for it.
So Henry VII has Mary and Margaret, and Mary gets in trouble for marrying people that she's not supposed to, right?
She got married without her brother's permission, yeah.
Yeah.
She married for love. Weird.
And then Margaret, she marries into Scotland. They have a kid, James V of Scotland, and then he marries some chick from France, Mary of Guise, who then... Guy. I've heard Guise. But she then sends Mary Stuart away to France because that's where she was. And
then Mary of Guise is the regent who rules Scotland
while Mary's off in France. Yeah. And then Mary is married to the Dauphin of France, and then he dies, and then she comes back to Scotland, and then has Lord Darnley, his kid, and then she finds out he's a real tool, and has James.
Yeah. And then there's a mysterious explosion in a hunting lodge.
Right.
How'd that happen?
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out that Henry VIII, his first queen, Princess of Aragon, has Mary. His second queen, Anne Boleyn, has Elizabeth I. And his third queen, Jane Seymour, has Edward VI. And then the other 3 queens have nobody. Probably because he's so dang fat and out of health.
Yeah. But you can name, these are the names we know from history, from American history as well as British history. And most people, I think, if they study history, you could probably go through and name every king from 1485 all the way through today in 2019, actually now. Henry VII was a cheapskate. He was a good administrator. He knew he needed money. His country had been in war. The coffers of the court had been spent. So he was always counting his money. He did raise taxes, and he's built up a nest egg because that's what the king needed. In fact, the famous song, kids' nursery rhyme, is about him. Sing a song of sixpence, pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? The king was in the counting house, counting all his money. That's what he did. And where was the queen?
The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey.
So that also describes the relationship between the two of them. They cohabitated. They grew to like each other and become affectionate, but they definitely weren't in love in the early years. But he had a reputation of being a cheap. Now let me ask you a question, Colleen. If you're a parent and you're cheap, okay, and
are you making a suggestion?
you and you have 2 boys and you dote on one boy all the time, Arthur, and you ignore the other boy, and you're cheap, and you keep telling Henry and Arthur, don't spend money. When Henry gets the chance, what's he going to do?
When Henry has the chance, or when Arthur gets
Arthur doesn't get a chance. What is Henry going to do?
Henry VIII.
Yeah, what is he?
Blows tons of money.
Because he was always told by his dad that he couldn't spend money. So a little bit of tabooism, that's one of the reasons he became so extravagant.
Lavish, yeah.
So this is what Colleen was alluding to. Henry VII has no money, wants to reestablish England as a power. He wants to marry up, okay? He wants his children to marry up. Isabella of Castile has like 5 kids. She has too many kids. She has 2 sons and 3 girls. So when you talk about dowries, the older the children and the more male the children are, the more valuable are, right? Because because
boys are valuable.
Right. So the youngest female is going to be the least valuable child.
True that.
So this winds up being a good match because you have England's oldest boy and Spain's youngest girl, and even though Spain is a more powerful country, there's a form of parity there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So Arthur and Catherine get engaged, and then Arthur does what?
He dies.
Right. They had gotten married by mail. This is what you did back then. And so even though they never...
consummated.
We'll use that word. Who knows whether he was a wiener or not, since they never consummated.
Right. We don't even know if he had one.
Right. But they were technically married, so there used to be this rule in the Catholic Church that you couldn't marry your in-laws, essentially. And so Henry wanted to marry his sister-in-law to keep the marriage alliance in place. I also think there's something psychological about having what was Arthur's. Yeah. But he has to get permission. So who do you get permission from to break a church rule?
The Pope.
The Pope. So he gets permission from the Pope. He gets a dispensation to marry his brother's widow,
but not truly his wife.
Technically, yeah.
In quotes, yeah.
And they get married, and they live happily ever after.
No, they don't.
What? No? Oh, right. Because they only have, as you said earlier, Colleen, they have a daughter. And she's getting older, and he realizes he's not going to be able to have any more children with Catherine of Aragon, and so he starts to talk about divorcing her.
Yeah.
He starts talking to his best friend, Thomas More. Hey, Thomas
bishop,
More.
Right?
No. He's the chancellor.
Yeah.
He's like, hey, I think I'm going to divorce her. And he's like, you can't divorce her. We're Catholic. You can't do it. He's like, well, I'll ask the Pope. And the Pope says no for a very logical reason. The Pope was surrounded by the army of Charles V, who was related to Catherine.
Yeah.
But the point being is that Thomas More said, no, you can't do it. It's against the rules of the church. And the Pope said no, so we can't do it. And Henry did what then?
Well, he started stoinking Anne and got her prego, and that helped his
what does he do to his
motivation.
best friend, Thomas More?
He kills him.
Yeah. My best friend, he told me no. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of you. So in his pursuit of a male heir, Henry VIII manages to execute his best friend, divorce the wife that he had asked permission to get married to in the first place, he creates this new Anglican church. He confiscates the Catholic Church property for his personal benefit to match his extravagant spending. And then he ignores later on his two daughters, both of whom wind up being more politically astute than his wiener male heir that he desired so much. So, go for it. Do it again.
All right, on the left, we got Queen Aragon, and she has Mary. In the middle, Anne Boleyn. She has Elizabeth the First. Notice the pattern? Henry only has girls. Then we have Seymour,
yep.
Jane Seymour, and she has Edward.
And I looked, you had asked me about whether Edward had red hair, and apparently he might have had a tinge of red hair too, because there was that comment that I read about all of the descendants of Elizabeth of York share her red hair. So I want to go back and add to what Colleen just said, that though it's important to remember too that Catherine of Aragon was Catholic, therefore her daughter Mary is
Catholic,
and that Anne Boleyn was the Protestant wife of the king, therefore Elizabeth is raised Protestant. Although Elizabeth doesn't remember her mom because her mom was executed, I think she was 3 years old when her mom was executed.
But she was raised by Protestants anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Seymours.
So, girl, boy, guess who becomes the ruler?
Boy.
So the wiener boy, Edward VI, becomes king, even though he's a minor, and a minor has to have regents to rule for them. And so Jane Seymour's brothers, Thomas and Edward, become the regents. He was crowned when he was only 10 years old. Could you imagine being king at 10 years old? And he dies when he's 15. So all of a sudden his...
But not until he destroyed a bunch of churches.
Well, he had nothing to do with it, right?
Wow.
I mean, his uncles were doing it. But what I want to talk about, though, is this. So the uncles have total, absolute power through their nephew for 5 years. And then when their nephew dies, that means they're going to be totally locked out because the daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, become the heirs. So conveniently...
They hope it'll be...
Edward signs this a will allegedly naming his cousin Jane, who was also a minor, as his heir.
Yeah.
How convenient that the uncles were named as regents of this new minor monarch. But it didn't work out for Jane. Yeah. So when Mary got wind that her brother had died, she had a network of secret Catholics throughout England, and all of the secret Catholics throughout England raised a Catholic army in the heat of the moment as soon as they got word, and they all rushed towards London. They get to the gates of London before the gates can be closed. They get inside. Now they close the gates of London, so the Protestant armies are outside of London, the Catholic armies inside London, and they seize power. They seize the two uncles. They seize Jane.
Poor Jane.
Jane doesn't make it.
No.
She lasts a couple of
days,
days,
She never wanted to be queen.
No.
That's risky business.
But Mary does want to be queen. And now Mary is the Queen of England. She undoes everything her brother and father did. She re-legalizes Catholicism. She makes Protestantism illegal. And begins the purges of Protestantism, which becomes later known as that's why she's later known as Bloody Mary. But I always like to point out that had the Catholics ultimately won these religious wars in England, we would be talking about Bloody Edward or maybe Bloody Elizabeth. That the bloody is just a perspective of who won history.
And how many they killed the opposite,
Well, I mean, Elizabeth killed tons of, hundreds of Catholics and Jesuits in particular. But
Mary was always worried that Elizabeth and her followers were going to overthrow her.
Mary, this is fun. Mary got engaged the first time when she was 2 to the King of France. That didn't work out. At the age of 6, she gets engaged to her first cousin, Charles V, but that doesn't work out either. But I want you to remember that her first cousin is Charles V.
Yeah, gross.
And then as a young woman, she's even her dad invested some authority in her, made her the de facto Princess of Wales, and gave her 3 years to rule Wales in
In between his deciding he liked her and not liked her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then that all, like, as you're saying, it falls apart when he gets married to Anne Boleyn. She's deemed illegitimate. She loses the title princess. She's referred to as Lady Mary, not Princess Mary. And they barely speak to each other. Later,
Shocking.
Jane Seymour makes Henry reconcile, but Henry insisted Mary agree to everything, and she's bullied into signing a document in which she agrees that her parents' marriage was unlawful, and that the papal authority should be repudiated, and that Henry's the head of the Church of England.
Jane tries.
Jane tries. Henry maybe tried a little too hard. But anyway, she's now the Queen of England. And she kills Jane.
Poor Jane.
But she has two problems. I guess there's kind of the same problem. She's not married.
Yeah.
And therefore,
need
because
heir
she's
to
not,
spare.
and therefore, if she's not married and doesn't have an heir and a spare, who's her heir?
Her sister.
Who's a
Protestant.
I know. Hey, notice what is in her hand in her portrait.
A red rose.
Called the Tudor Rose. So yeah, she's looking for a husband who's Catholic, and she's like, who do I know that's uber Catholic? Oh, those Spaniards. Hey, maybe I should marry that cousin of mine, Charles V. Oh wait, he's already married and has kids that are adult kids. So I'm gonna marry my first cousin's
once
son.
removed. Ew, that's like marrying Andrew.
Ew, marrying Andrew.
And even more inbred.
Right, but and then when we think about it, typically men marry younger women, right? In this case, there's the older woman who's marrying her cousin once removed. What I'm saying is, how invested do you think Philip was into this marriage?
Not very, which is why he spent most of his time in Spain.
They too barely consummated. They must have consummated at least once because she did think she was pregnant when she had the ovarian cancer, but they never did have children. And they barely saw each other. As Colleen said, he spent most of his time in Spain. So what do you think his vested interest was in the marriage then?
Not vested.
Well, he's not vested probably romantically, and he's not vested really in terms
I think
of heirs.
he hopes that he'll get England, right?
Yeah, well, for God. Because again, he's very Catholic and wants to re-Catholicize Spain. This is his vocation, his calling.
But then later on, he wants to with Elizabeth.
Well, after his wife's dead.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, and Elizabeth is younger, probably closer to his age.
Yeah.
And actually, and Elizabeth is not related to him.
True
so
that.
It's not as gross.
Might be the first time they actually have some genetic diversity.
But anyhow, let's go back to Princess Elizabeth. She, too, had been kind of written out of things once Edward was born. Although, as you said, Jane Seymour tried. She would bring the family together for holidays and stuff.
And Jane was Protestant, which made Elizabeth better.
Yeah. Elizabeth winds up succeeding Mary when Mary dies. And it's this huge thing. And you already talked about it. Just some background information. So, Mary dies, leaving Philip as the king of England. But he's in Spain, and he's Catholic and speaks Spanish.
Nobody likes him.
Nobody likes him. And so the English wrestle with this moment of consciousness or nationalism. Do we want a Catholic king
No.
who's male
No.
but speaks Spanish, or will we put up with the fact that this queen is a girl and Protestant, but is at least English and speaks English? And so because
I guess
remember
we'll take the girl.
But remember, it's a big issue because the people in power at this point are Catholic. The Catholics had to go along with allowing Elizabeth to claim the throne.
True that.
And so in this famous portrait, it's the backstory of the Spanish Armada, because what Elizabeth did is by mail flirted with her brother-in-law Philip, and what she was really doing is buying time to establish herself on the throne of England and ward off the Spanish coming and seizing power. Eventually, Philip II got frustrated and said, "Fine, I'm invading," and he raises the largest naval armada at the time. It's still only the second largest ever, I think. The Spanish Armada, and they invade in 1588. She's established herself politically in England, but she doesn't have much money, and she has no navy. and she's about to be invaded by the second largest navy of all time. Remember what she does?
Mm-mm.
She does what I call she creates an instant navy. Who do we?
Navy?
Yeah, she has no navy. Where is there an unallied naval force in the world?
I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Pirates. The pirates have been attacking the Spanish treasure fleets for decades, and some of those pirates, a lot of them were English. So what she does, she calls one of the most respected pirates to court, and she pardons him.
What was his name?
Sir Francis Drake. She pardons him.
Oh, he's the hot guy at the Ren Fest.
And knights him on the spot. Sir Francis Drake declares him to be the admiral of her non-existent fleet, and then says to him, "Go out and you can pardon any pirate you find as long as they swear allegiance to me." She goes from having zero navy to having the second largest navy in the world.
And that's why she's an awesome ruler.
And then I want you to think about these Spanish ships versus these pirate ships. Spanish ships, most of them, their purpose is to do what?
Carry people and weapons.
Weapons, people, and treasure. So they have to be these large ships. Okay?
Yep.
Pirate ships, their purpose is to do what?
Sneak in and steal shit.
Right, hit and run. Their ships are small and fast. The big Spanish ships are fat and slow. And so when the Spanish Armada strikes across the English Channel, not only does a tropical storm, probably a hurricane by today's terminology, hit the English Channel and destroy a large portion of the fleet, but they go to anchor, as any fleet does during a storm. They go to anchor, and while they're at anchor, these small, fast English ships dart in and out, sinking the Spanish Armada.
And thanks to that hurricane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the chances? English, Queen Elizabeth is a badass.
She's a rock star.
She was the golden age of the Tudor dynasty, probably the golden age of England. She claimed authority over Ireland, but she did not have authority in Scotland, which Colleen was talking about.
Queen of Scots.
Tudor architecture is considered, described usually as stucco and exposed wood. But she dies with no children, because here's the tragedy.
She's the Virgin Queen.
Because if she gets married, what happens?
Then she's not in power anymore.
Right.
Goes to some dude.
So she uses her sexuality. She flirts with Philip II of Spain. She flirts with Sir Walter Raleigh. She uses men to get what she needs politically. But in many ways, I consider her a tragic hero, because she never got to enjoy male company, literally or figuratively, because she couldn't take the chance of becoming pregnant, because that would delegitimize her. And so she spends her life as the Virgin Queen, which means her cousins' children are her heirs.
Yes.
And so this is the rise of the House of Stuart. Do you want to do this?
No.
All right. So her cousin's son, right? Or cousin's son.
Her cousin's son, yeah.
Her cousin's son is James VI of Scotland. He knows
Also
most of his
known
life that he's going to become the King of England. And so this is what's really important. There's a peaceful transfer of power. He knows it's coming. She knows it's coming. And everything's fine except Mary, Queen of Scots, is an idiot. But other than that, the other thing that's great about James VI of Scotland is that he inherits the throne of England and becomes James the First of England as an adult. He's almost 40 years old when he inherits. He knows how to play the system. He knows that he's an absolute monarch in Scotland, and he knows he's a constitutional monarch in England. And he wears those two hats separately. And he's even, okay, flexible when it comes to religion. I mean, as the King of Scotland, he was Presbyterian, even though his mother was Catholic. But he's okay converting to Anglicanism to become the King of England and the head of the Church of England.
Because really, Anglican, Presby, they're all Protestant.
Yeah, they're all Protestant. There was a Catholic conspiracy to kill James. It's known as the Gunpowder Plot. It's in the part of the plot line of the movie V for Vendetta. But what happened is that, similar to nowadays in 2019, we know where the entire U.S. government will be on one particular day of the year. We know that at the State of the Union, the entire U.S. government will be in the same room. Perfect place for a terrorist attack. Well, there's only one place that we know the monarch of England will be on any in the calendar year, And that is the opening of Parliament. Yeah, only the Queen or the King can open Parliament. So
okay, wait, quit. This is a good time to tell us what Parliament means.
Parlement en français.
Parlement.
Parler means to speak en français. So the Parlement is the building in which you speak.
But in Germany?
It's called a thing. You love that, don't you?
I do.
And then in Germanic or
the thing.
it's the Wegemont, in ancient. No, that might be the Norse.
But you have the king and the thing.
Yeah. So the Catholics and Guy Fawkes is the most famous of the plotters. They know that the king has to be in Parliament to open Parliament. They fill the basement of Parliament with explosives. They're going to blow up Parliament, blow up the king, seize the government. Except somebody notices they leave the door open, checks the basement, finds the gunpowder, and they do not blow up.
Not as successful as Game of Thrones.
When they blow up there.
With the green
oh
stuff.
my God. But again, another example of how they're stealing from history to make those plot lines. But so there's been a tradition now for 400 years that the monarch of England, before they open Parliament, what do they do every year? They check the basement.
Oh.
So I want you to picture Queen Elizabeth II in her ancient age going down the basement stairs, because it's part of the ritual now. You always check the basement before you open Parliament.
I hope they have installed one of those little cart thingies that she sits and then
goes
down the stairs. Yeah.
Do you think she brings the corgis?
Probably. She should.
Actual photos of the gunpowder plot. So, remember when I was saying how his intelligence was to rule the two kingdoms separately.
Yeah.
The problem is his son is an idiot. Right? This alternating theory of leadership that I've talked about. That Charles I grows up, he doesn't understand, Dad, why are you nice to the people in England when you just tell people what to do when you're in Scotland? When I'm king, I'm going to do it my way, and I'm just going to tell everybody what to do.
That doesn't sound like TJ.
He believes in what becomes known as divine right of kings, personified most by Louis XIV of France. But Charles I, I love this portrait on the right, where can you see who's putting the crown on his head? God.
Oh, it's a hand from the
I
crowd.
don't need you, because God put the crown on my head. Charles I is an idiot. And so he tries to rule England. He dissolves Parliament like 4 or 5 times. And finally the English people are like, you know what? We're going to raise arms against the king.
Yes.
The guy on the left, I won't say his name out loud.
Oliver Cromwell.
Don't ever say it again. So OC, because he's a member of Parliament.
He does a good thing for England. He's just not so hot to Ireland.
Way.
He takes Charles I out because he's a dingbat.
Right. Well, let me first tell the story before he takes him out.
Okay.
So there's this English Civil War, and on one side you have the Royalists, led by Prince Rupert and the King, and their armies are known as the Cavaliers because they have a lot of money to have the equipment that goes with having cavalry. And then on the other side of it, you have the Parliamentarian army, which is led by the Roundheads, and their general is
General Roundhead. Oh, Oliver Cromwell. Sorry.
Right, and so the two armies fight. The Roundheads defeat the Cavaliers, they seize the king, and the king says, I'm sorry.
Why are they called Roundheads?
Because they're Puritans, they're the ancestors of Congregationalists, and they only wore black and brown, no buttons, and they all had what's called a censured haircut to show their piety, whereas the Cavaliers all wore wigs to show how rich they were. So it was basically the Whigs versus the Roundheads.
The Whigs versus the Balds?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyways, the king gets captured and goes, I'm sorry, my bad, I won't do it again. And they release him. Guess what he does?
He does it again.
Right? So then there's a second phase of the Civil War, and this time he says, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. And they're like, shame on me the first time. Yeah, that whole thing. And so they decide they're going to kill him. And they kill the king. An act of regicide.
Off with his head.
Off with his head. They kill the king. But back to your point, I disagree that he did good things for England, because what happens over time is he just becomes like a king without the name king. There's this period called the Commonwealth, when England
Oliver
was
Cromwell.
a republic, and we just pretend it didn't happen. Nowadays we call it the interregnum. But that's what I mean is, like, when you think about Charles the First, what do we not like about Charles the First? He didn't consult with Parliament. He was a hereditary ruler, and he was a dick.
Yeah.
Or a wiener. All right. Well, your guy OC, he doesn't consult Parliament. He bans people from Parliament and arrests them if they disagree with him. He's a dick.
He's trying to be his own king.
And then the final straw is he names it as his heir.
His own son.
His own son, Richard. So
again, a dick.
What's the difference between, if it walks like a duck,
the idea was a good start, but
then
it
fell apart.
Yeah.
So then,
like
if you're the English people,
the ring of power, and
yeah.
I mean, now we're at
power corrupts and absolute power corrupts.
What
absolutely.
movie is that? Fellowship of the Ring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the
Lord of the Rings. Yeah. So you have a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're gonna steal that ring of power, but then you put
become
it on.
corrupted by
yeah.
it. Like Lord Acton said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the English people are like, wait, we can have either the fake king or a real king. Might as well just bring back the real king.
And they're both
so
the same.
They bring back the sons of Charles the First. It's called the Restoration. Charles II becomes the new king, and his heir is his brother James. They had grown up in France in exile, and now they've been restored. One of the first things that Charles II does is he names his brother to be not just the Duke of York, but also the Duke of Albany. Hence, the capital of New York is Albany. Right. And he's also named the Lord of Admiral of the Fleet. Now, James is a fascinating person. He's the heir presumptive, but everybody's like, it'll never get to him because Charles young. Charles will have kids, but Charles never does have kids. And so the fact that James had married a commoner, Anne Hyde, that's where when I called Woodville Anne earlier, I was confusing it with Anne Hyde. So they have 6 children that die in infancy and 2 daughters who survive to adulthood, Mary and Anne.
Thank God.
Now all of a sudden,
more girls.
Charles II is getting older and older with no children. James marries a commoner, but we didn't stop it in time. But at least he has adult children, but they're girls.
Oh.
And then it gets weird because James starts. He secretly converts to Catholicism, and it's the worst kept secret in England. But then Parliament passes what's known as the Test Act. Now, the Test Act says to be an officer in the military or a public servant,
aka king,
or like anybody, like a chancellor, like a clerk, a judge, you have to swear that you're Protestant.
Yeah.
It's called the Test Act. James, remember I said he became the Duke of York and the Duke of Albany, and then what was the third thing? His brother made him the
I don't remember.
Lord High Admiral. He's a member of the military. He has to take I'm
a Protestant.
He refuses to take the test. He refuses the Test Act. His Catholicism is now public information, but they don't punish him. His brother doesn't punish him. His brother loves him, but the other people in England do not. But what his brother does is, which is brilliant, his brother takes his niece, James's daughter Mary, and marries her to a Protestant leader on the continent, so that Charles II calms everybody down by showing, hey, look, James might be Catholic and weird, but he's almost as old as I am. The next Queen of England and the next King of England after them will be Protestant. Everything's going to be fine. James does become king. They accept him because of the Rye House plot, where there was a Republican attempt to kill both Charles and James. Charles dies, James becomes king, everybody's dealing with it. He passes this thing called the Declaration of Indulgence. They don't like it. He was using his powers as head of the Anglican Church to be nice to Jews and Catholics. They don't like it, but they're putting up with it. But in 1688, he makes them do the Declaration of Indulgence again, and the last straw, he gets remarried to a young 15-year-old girl from Italy who's Catholic, and they have a boy, Prince James Francis Edward Stuart.
He comes back
because he's now a Catholic, and he's
an heir,
and he automatically bumps up over his sisters.
Yeah.
So Parliament invites William of Orange to England.
Because they don't want a Catholic.
And they think this is a good idea. It's going to be glorious.
Because it worked, well, because that didn't work so well with Bloody Mary in the first.
No, but this is glorious.
Catholic.
In fact, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurs when the House of Stuart and Orange seize the throne from James II. And the reason it's called glorious, because from the English perspective and the Protestant perspective, they now have power again, and 0 people died in the coup. James II goes to where he knows there are going to be Catholics that don't like English people. Where are there Catholics that hate English people?
Spain.
That's true. Who hates English people even more?
The Pope.
How about the Irish?
Oh.
He goes to Ireland and says, hey, I'm Catholic. Did I mention that? Nah, I'm Catholic. Wouldn't you love to have a Catholic king? And so he rallies the Irish armies. There's his son-in-law and nephew, William, lands with the English army. There's a huge battle called Battle of the Boyne. William defeats James, and that's what solidifies the Orange Protestant dominance of Ireland that lasts for a couple hundred years.
But not all of Ireland.
No, all of Ireland until 1922.
Oh.
So that brings us, as I said, to 1688.
Oh, that explains that. Okay.
So the House of Stuart is now in charge through the marriage with the House of Orange. Mary and William are the co-reigning monarchs. They have equal authority. She is not a queen consort. But they're so musical and magical together. They might as well be a concert.
Right.
And then, but they have no kids. Seems to be a recurring problem. Then she dies. So now he's the king by himself. And everything's going fine, except for he goes out on a horse trip.
Whoops.
And his horse, Sorrel is this horse's name, steps on a mole hole. The king is thrown from the horse and dies shortly afterwards from his injuries. He did not say,
a horse, my kingdom for a horse?
No, he didn't say that. He could have, he should have, but he didn't. All right, so then his sister-in-law, Queen Anne, becomes...
Who was Mary's sister?
Mm-hmm, yeah, his sister-in-law, Mary's sister, James's daughter. She's now the Queen of England. She's the last member of the House of Stuart because she, too, has no heirs.
Kids.
And also, if she did get married and have kids, the name would change. She's still going to be the last of Stuart. So then, now you're Parliament.
You got nobody.
You're running out of people. And what's worse than having no people is what happens if you have Catholic people.
Oh, God.
They go through who's closest in relation to the House of Stuart. They find 50 Catholics.
Catholic. No.
They have to go through 50 Catholic claimants to find a good Protestant family. They find it in the royal family of the Kingdom of Hanover and in the person of George. George I of Hanover is invited to become the King of England.
And doesn't speak a lick of English.
And he's an adult. He becomes king as an adult, and he's a little stubborn and refuses to learn English. Do you think Parliament was upset that he refused to learn English?
Probably.
At first they were. They're like, what is he doing? And then, what's the silver lining if the king can't speak the language?
Hey, they can decide everything.
They love it!
Yeah, he can sign whatever. They'll just tell him something else.
Yeah, so...
I can't read it.
So they have 2 children, George and Sophia. George is king for 13 years. He dies, and then his son, George II, becomes king. George II is the last English monarch born outside of England. He's also the last English monarch to ever fight on the field of battle.
But he does speak English.
But he does speak English. And he survived the coup attempt by the pretenders. Specifically,
he's not really technically a pretender. He
just
happens to be Catholic, which is why they didn't.
They're actually legitimate, in my opinion. Yeah, the royal family of England is the pretenders.
Yeah, the Hanoverians.
And the great pretenders. You want to sing?
No.
Okay.
Freddie did it better.
So Charles Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charles, he's the son of that Prince James that had been born that precipitated the Glorious Revolution. George II was his son, and he didn't get along. It was a very estranged relationship. His son actually took the other side in Parliament. Awkward. And if you think that's bad, well, George II had done the same thing to George I. But George II's son died before he could become king, and so he was succeeded by his grandson, who creatively took the name
George III. It's like naming your cat Miss Kitty.
So George III, he's really famous in American history. He's the last king of the colonies. He ruled over the end of the French and Indian War. He ruled during the American War of Independence. He ruled during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. There was a lot of stress.
Well, that's probably why his head's so tiny.
and it didn't expand with all the stress, and so he went nutso. It went crazy. I've been to his castle in England. Did I ever tell you the story about his locks?
No.
So picture you putting your key into your lock, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, when you put a key into a lock, which way do you turn it to unlock it?
To the right, isn't it? No, to the left.
Yeah, lefty loosey, righty tighty, right? So you turn the key to the left to unlock it. He was so paranoid and delusional by the end of his life. He had a gun built into his lock in his bedroom door at the Windsor Castle, but he put the locking mechanism backwards.
Oh.
So that if you put the key into his bedroom door and you turn it to the left to unlock it, the gun inside the locking mechanism would shoot you. You had to know to turn the key in the wrong direction.
Wow.
And that's a whole nother layer of paranoia. So he was stripped of power in the Regency Act
I can't imagine
of 1811.
how he lost his mind. Good grief.
I know. I actually, we were just talking about how the pretenders are actually the legitimate kings, and these are the pretenders. Here's another issue: the Act of Regency in 1811. How does a law become a law? Like, think of the United States. Congress passes a law. Does that make it the law?
No, it has to be held up, doesn't it?
Not held up. It has to be.
I don't know.
So Congress passes a law, and they send it to the president. He has to sign it.
Yeah.
Right. So a law is only the law if the president signs it. Same thing in England. The law is only the law if the king signs it. Guess who never signed the Regency Act of 1811?
George III.
Right.
Yeah.
So the entire Regency is illegal.
Oh.
Anyways, so in 1763, the English had won the French and Indian War, and so that's when the French are forced out of Canada. Canada becomes an English colony, and that's when the Proclamation of 1763. The English are starting to push into India, and it's really the rise of the Golden Age. Or the second golden age of England. They passed the Act of Union, uniting the two crowns, the crown of England with the crown of Scotland. They create a new name. So, like, if England plus Wales is Britain, Britain plus Scotland is Great Britain, and then years later they add Ireland to the mix too. That if Great Britain plus Ireland becomes known as the United Kingdom. So George rules for a long time. He died when he was in his 80s. His son, who was his regent, then takes the throne as in the person of George the Fourth. And then we have this problem where, once again, a fertility issue. While George III had tons of sons, his sons did not have tons of grandsons. And so ultimately George IV dies with no heir. So his brother becomes the King of England, the sailor king, the soldier king, the great William IV. He's just a badass. He's so cool. But he dies with no heirs. And so his niece, Victoria, is the only living member of the House of Hanover. Parliament's like, we don't want to go through this again. And I think you've watched a couple of videos on this about how they kept her. She wasn't even allowed to go up and down the stairs by herself because she was the only heir, right?
Yep.
And then the other issue that was dwelling on their minds is the only thing that worse than having no heir would be having a minor, because then there would be a power play for who would be the regents. And fortunately, she turned 18 less than a month before her uncle died.
Thank goodness.
So she inherits the throne as an 18 and 1 month-year-old. And she wrote in her diary,
I was awake at 6 o'clock by Mama, who told me the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord were here and wished to see me. I got out of bed and went into my sitting room, only in my dressing gown, and alone, and saw them. Lord
Cunningham.
That's not Cunningham.
Yes, it
that's
is.
Then acquainted me that my uncle, the poor king, my poor uncle, the king, was no more and had expired 12 minutes past 2 this morning, and consequently, I am queen.
Fun fact: her name's not Victoria.
No, it's not.
What's her name?
Well, I mean, it becomes Victoria, Alexandrina.
And so on the first day they use the name Queen Alexandrina Victoria, but it's never used again.
Nope.
She goes on
Only
to
by
be
her
queen.
mama.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, she marries her sweetheart Albert. They had known each other for their whole lives. They're also cousins. They get married. They have kids and kids and kids and kids. Their kids have kids and kids and kids.
And
the fertility problem that has plagued the royal family is no more. At the same time, that doesn't matter because there's no power left to being the monarch. That's called #irony.
Yeah, true that. And you know what's funny? Is that Victoria apparently wanted to stop having sex with Albert because every time she did, she kept getting pregnant, and she was tired of being pregnant. She didn't really like kids.
Yeah. So
I mean, she's the life of the party.
Right. But yeah, so the Hohenzollerns, the Romanovs, the Danes, and the Brits, they're all the same family. And so the irony is in World War I, those were all first cousins that were fighting each other. During the reign of Queen Victoria, she became known as Empress Victoria of India. The British finished their conquest of India. They also completed the scramble for Africa, building the railroads connecting Cape Town to Cairo. The royal family, though, changes names. It becomes the House of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha.
Because she's a freaking girl, and you always take the boy's name.
But, and Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, it's just rolls off the tongue.
So much better than the other name.
She's succeeded by her playboy son, Edward VII, the party goer. Everybody loved him, though. He did one of the first world tours by a British monarch. But everybody loved him, except for his mommy. He died in the middle of a constitutional crisis where the lower house of Parliament had stripped the older upper house, the House of Lords, of their power. So really, Victoria and Edward are the last monarchs to have any real power. They become symbols. One of those symbols is George V, who's the king of England during that World War I that I mentioned. He's first cousins with the Kaiser of Germany, and he's first cousins with the Tsar of Russia. They actually look ridiculously alike, too, if you ever see a picture of the three together. He was not supposed to become king, but his older brother died, leaving the throne to him. He became the king emperor at the death of his father in 1910.
And then they decide, ooh.
That's awkward. We're the Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha family, and we're fighting.
A German name.
Ooh, I hope nobody figures that out, that we're Germans. Hey, I got an idea.
Let's change our name.
What's your favorite castle?
Windsor.
All right, we're going to be the House of Windsor. See what I did there? The Castle of Windsor became the House of Windsor. On July 17th, 2017, towards the end of World War I, the royal family changes their name to a very English-sounding term, Windsor.
Because we can't be German during World War I.
And George V, he later dies. He's succeeded by his playboy son, Edward VIII. Do you want to talk about Edward VIII?
No.
He loved to party, didn't like being told what to do. He's good looking, he's charismatic.
And he dresses like crap because Wallace Simpson dresses him.
He really fancied a divorced American socialite.
Twice divorced.
Wallace Simpson, he became the king and promptly announced he was going to marry Wallace Simpson. And the leaders of Parliament started talking to Edward's brother, Bertie, and said he can't marry her. If he marries her, he can't be king. And Bertie goes to have the most awkward conversation of his life, where he has to tell his older, charismatic, flashy, lovable brother,
you can't be king.
And I, the uncharismatic, stammering brother, need to replace you.
Yeah.
And so Edward is only king for about a year. He's exiled. He's given, as an exit interview, he's given the title Duke of Windsor, but spends most of the rest of his life living in France.
Yeah, which isn't so hard because he still gets his
stipend. Yeah. He did try to backstab his brother too. Remember in World War II?
Yeah, that's
He's like,
true.
"Oh, Hitler."
Hey, buddy, Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, Wallace, look how badly she's dressed. And, by the way, they collect pugs.
That's a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
Oh. So then, Bertie, we have King Bert, right?
Yeah, King Bert.
No, we don't have King Bert. Bertie decides that for the sake of showing the continuity of the royal family,
because nobody can be anything but George and Edward.
He takes the name, instead of King Albert, he takes the name King George. He then is George VI, and he rules for about 20 years or so. He's the king that gives the famous King's Speech, right?
Yeah.
We've all seen that movie. He too has two daughters. So those daughters who were born as just daughters of a duke, members of the royal family, now have become immediately the heirs. Specifically, the oldest is Elizabeth, and she takes to her new role as heir presumptive very seriously. And her sister Margaret?
She's a partier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She probably would have gotten along really well with her uncle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and her great-grandfather?
Yeah.
Edward, yeah.
She was not the best.
But George VI and his oldest daughter Elizabeth, they are the buckle down type. They ruled at the peak of the empire, 1940 to 1945, when England fights World War II, ultimately replaced by the United States as the global superpower, but it's still a power. Elizabeth II herself, do you know the story about how she found out she was queen?
I'm not sure.
She was on tour, and did I tell you the story? She's on tour in Africa.
I saw it on PBS show.
Yeah, it's amazing. So, as you know, like a duke is called your grace, and a prince is called your highness, and a king or queen is called your majesty. And so she was on tour in Africa when her dad died, and somebody approached her tent and knocked on it and said, "Excuse me, your majesty."
Royal Highness.
No, Royal Highness was what she was as princess. They knocked on the door and said, "Excuse me, your majesty." And when she heard those two words, "Your majesty," she knew her dad was dead. So she is amazing, as we all know. She is the head of the Commonwealth, the queen regnant of many independent countries in the Commonwealth. She also reigned over major constitutional changes and the devolution of the governments in Northern Ireland and Scotland. And she
gave back the stone.
She gave back the stone of Scone. She ruled over during the decolonization of Africa, the independence movements in India that had started during the time of her father.
New Zealand.
And then when South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon wanted nothing to do with the royal family anymore and became republics, she was the queen that signed those agreements with them separating from the Commonwealth. And she, most remarkably, she went to Dublin, Ireland, and visited the tomb of the unknown soldier from the, or not unknown soldier, but the tombs from the Easter Day Rising in 1916. You can imagine the security, the Queen of England visiting Ireland. They had to bring in cops from other countries.
And let's not forget that she and the Pope get along. Well, the Pope says...
She is the head of the Anglican Church, and such, she has met with her equals, the heads of the Catholic Church. So there you go. That's the history of the kings of Wessex, the kings of the Anglo-Saxons,
kings and queens of England,
the kings and queens of Great Britain,
and then United Kingdom.
And then the only two, the king and the queen, there's only been two. We have had one king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and one queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And who the next king or queen is, we'll have to wait to see.
We'll see if Charles. What's the favorite quote about Charles?
The terrible thing about waiting your whole life to become king is it necessitates the death of your mother. And then with his divorce, there's questions whether he'll ever inherit too, or whether he will pass it along to his son, the queen's grandson.
Was Camilla divorced? Yeah. So she could never be queen.
Things are changing.
Yeah.
Well, hey, but thanks for checking in. My name's Tom Keefe. I'm the Babbling Professor. And here's my new
husband.
Sidekick, Colleen the Cocoa Not Wiener whatever. Member of the
Non-babbling.
descendant of the Lancastrians and John of Gaunt. Hey, thanks for listening. Have a great day.